I was living in a communal house in Stockwell, and it must have been round about my birthday, which is in the middle of the year. And my housemates said to me, "What time do you finish work tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, 4 o'clock." And they said, "Well, you have to be home exactly on 4 o'clock." And they said, "Well, we're going to take you for a magic mystery tour." The blindfold was taken off my eyes, and I was standing totally, that close to two big black vinyl doors, and on the vinyl doors, in big white writing on black, it said, "This is New Zealand." And I just pushed the doors open and walked into an auditorium where the lights were going down. And then up came the 3-screen installation. And it was brilliant. And instead of curing me of my homesickness, as my housemates had hoped, it brought me home.
Well, I was a young reporter for The Listener, and I saw it in the Embassy Theatre, and I was absolutely stunned and blown away by it.
The whole nation was sort of suddenly swollen with pride about this movie.
It really shows New Zealand as a big, promising place.
I actually loved it very much because I didn't believe that it's made 40 years ago.
You could put different clothes on the people and it could be today.
It's impeccably designed.
We definitely put New Zealand on the map.
I joined the film unit in 1962, and from that period on, through the whole of the 60s and much of the 70s, at the National Film Unit old studios in Miramar, we had a heck of a lot of freedom to do what we wanted under Mr. Jeffrey Scott, the manager. But we didn't always recognise how fortunate we were at the time.
We really had a pretty good ride. We did have a lot of latitude.
And it was a great place to work. There was a camaraderie and sort of a fairly casual atmosphere.
And the best thing about the film unit was, it never really was a job. Oh, we got paid so much a week to do it, and worked all the overtime that you could work. But it was never a job, It was like all these young guys going to a place, doing something that excited them,
And Jeff Scott, of course, did nurture the place.
Our staff all loved New Zealand. They loved making films, and they were keen, young, enthusiastic, and most creative.
Jeff Scott was the manager. Technically he was the manager, but in fact he was the executive producer. Mac Ashley, who was the technical manager, he went off on an overseas trip to Montreal when they were having their expo in 1967, and he saw the IMAX presentation, he saw various countries' presentations, films. When he came back he said, multi-screen seems to be the way to go, and if we're going to do a film for Osaka, we ought to do one like that. And he talked to Jeff Scott, the manager, and they thought, yes, it might be quite a good idea.
I decided the 3-screen thing gave us the best latitude for creative ability in presenting New Zealand. The head of Industries and Commerce and all his people opposed this idea vividly. They didn't like it at all. They didn't want any film in Expo 1970. Didn't want any film. J.R. Marshall called a meeting at Parliament Buildings, and 7 of the Industries and Commerce people rolled up, And J.R. Marshall turned to me and said, well, what do you think, Jeff? I think we ought to have a film. I said, most certainly you need a film. You would want a film for this. It will do you more good than anything. And he said, well, you've helped us in the past. I think we'll have a film. So we'll have a film, gentlemen. Well, the intersection Communist people were aghast. They wanted to argue us all out and put all their stuff in. So I said, well, good, that's fine. He said, can you do it? He said, I said, we can do it. We'll do it.
The problem for the film unit was that they could not do IMAX. They didn't have Panavision. They didn't even have CinemaScope or any form of anamorphic lens. So given the resources they possessed, a three-screen presentation was the way to go.
We came to a question of money. Well, how much is this going to cost you? I scratched myself and I said, it's going to cost $300,000 to do this. $150,000 to make the film and $150,000 for plant.
This entailed, of course, getting three cameras, either three cameras shooting at the same time or separate cameras shooting, but also they had to be synced up together. They had to run in synchronisation.
I remember at the time running into you, Hugh, and you were going, and I said, what are you making? And you went this, and I went, 3 screens? Ooh, sounds like 3 times the problems to me.
And I remember my producer, who was at that time Ron Bowie, he came in and he said, God almighty, he said, will it work? Could you ever do it? And I said, we're going to do it. The trouble was finding somebody with the imagination to handle the concept of 3-screen presentation. This was my problem. And we had a young director who'd done jolly good work, and his name was Hugh Macdonald.
Mr. Scott called me into his office and told me about the job and said I was going to direct it. I was a bit floored, actually, and I wondered, what can we do with 3 screens that we can't do with 1? And he said, oh, you'll find a way.
We'll put him in charge of this and see what happens.
I thought, well, it's too complex for me to do it entirely on my own as a director, so I wanted somebody to co-author it with me in terms of writing it and editing it, and I thought Dave Jordan is brilliant in these fields. He's got the right kind of visual and musical imagination, and I thought he'd make an excellent collaborator.
I had to get equipment, I had to buy equipment, an editing bench with 3 films and all the associated gear. The projectors, the 3 projectors, which I got from Japan.
And Dave Jordan and I started writing the treatment, first working by day at the unit studios and then carrying on at night at my flat. And at the same time, I was busy making a final selection of the key people in the film crews. On my crew were Kel Fowler on camera and Kit Rawlings on sound. And Dave's crew, there was Murray Creed on camera and Noel Sheridan on sound. And Rob's crew had Sam Grau on camera and Brian Shannon on sound. Once we got all the crew finalised, the next stage was to test the practicalities of the whole central idea of 3 cameras and 3 screens. So we just took 3 cameras and bolted them on a board and went out around the streets of Wellington and shot some test material.
They were very different times. They weren't digital times where you could do anything. You had, whatever you did, you had to do physically. And the idea of having three cameras bolted together and 3 projectors was quite exciting for us.
In 1969, I remember the great excitement that went throughout the film unit when This Is New Zealand went into production.
Everybody was just enthusiastic about this fact that we were doing something which we hoped was going to help New Zealand to make an impression in Japan and around the world.
We had 3 crews on the road for months. That was fine for me as I didn't have a family at the time, but it was different for Murray and Kit and Cal.
It was quite hard really because our daughter was about 3 at the time, and I felt that she was always sick, or if any drama happened, he was away, you know.
The extended periods that we had on the road were pretty tough on our families.
But at the same time, he always tried to make me feel part of the film or part of what he was doing. So, and I was quite proud of what he was doing, so it worked out all right. But I did feel, you know, sometimes he was not there when Dad should be there.
One of my earliest recollections was being away for an extended period and coming home, looking forward to seeing my little boy, who was then 18 months, and he ran to the door, took one look at me and headed off, and that was hard.
Well, much to my amazement, I was actually selected to be one of the directors after having voted against it.
And we went away for about 5 weeks, as I recall, on one shoot.
The Molesworth shoot for this as New Zealand was possibly the most difficult shoot I ever did at the NFU.
We were given a list of places like Rotorua, Taupo, Coromandel, so on.
We left Wellington, we saw the sun up to Levin, and from Levin to the Cape Reinga, it rained.
It just never stopped raining.
It just rained and rained and rained.
Once we were into that swamp, we realised it was probably just easy to keep going. We went for miles and miles, and we got a puncture in the middle of the swamp.
And so we would come to Taupo, and it was like raining, so we decided we'll cut our losses and go to Rotorua, and it'd be raining.
We realised we had no jack.
Well, let's get out of this whole region, we'll go to Tauranga, it must be fine on the east coast. It was still raining, and it rained and rained, and we got up to Auckland, and we hadn't shot anything.
Noel Sheridan and Dave Jordan, who were with me, both were underneath the Land Rover from time to time, swapping stones so that we could get it up bit by bit until we could change the wheel.
Just as we were getting down near towards Featherston somewhere, the sun broke through the clouds, and there was shafts of golden light came down on this one sheep standing on the thing, and Sam and I both said, yes, and we leapt out of the van.
And at a certain stage, nearing the completion of the change, I felt all my vertebrae go ping, 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 ping down my back and sung out, get out, get out, get out.
And Sam got shot, and that's still my favourite shot in the whole movie.
The consequences of which just recently I had major back surgery, I have a funny feeling might have started on that day.
I was once asked by a young man from the audience how long it took us to do all the filming, and I turned the question around and said, well, how long do you think it took? And he said, a week?
I remember shooting at Massey University, and we wanted a technician to be there doing some data, noting some data down, or looking as though they were noting data down, and I just happened to be not recording at the time, so I landed the white coat, told to stand in front of the camera, and I did that, and I was the white noddy in the white coat.
Not only staff members, but also their families were press-ganged into being in the film.
My daughter Helen, as an infant, was used being bottle-fed by Lee. There was also Nicky Creed, who was feeding in a high chair, and Nicky's grandfather, Murray's father, Eric, in his wonderful vegetable garden.
We filmed my parents and one of my mother's friends working in their prolific vegetable gardens. Everyone, in some way or another, got involved in filming This Is New Zealand.
But the whole staff got in behind this project, particularly the cameraman, Kel Fowler.
As well as shooting standard single camera material, Kel was responsible for all the triple camera rig shots. This was quite a complex procedure. It would take us at least an hour to set up for every shot, and it was a complex and demanding process. For Kit and me, going on the road with Kel was always a huge amount of fun, and he was extremely popular as chief cameraman. We miss him a lot, miss his personality and his great ability as a cinematographer.
He was a good guy, yeah.
Well, Kel was a very gregarious character.
It's a sort of a character that, in a crowd, if you didn't know him, as a sort of fellow you'd go and drink with. Simple as that, you know.
Kel had a very good eye for a frame.
And he was very dedicated, and he was a perfectionist as well with his work. He wanted the right shot.
We were shooting some demolition scenes in downtown Wellington, and a huge block of masonry came round, crashing down literally right in front of the camera, inches from the foot of the tripod. As the dust settled, Kel turned off the camera and turned around and gave me a triumphant grin, and I pointed to the 70-odd kilos of stone that was just ahead of him and said, "Weren't you scared?" And he said, "Hell no, it's only a movie." One very successful and popular film that Kel actually directed as well as photographed was 140 Days Under the World. This was one of only 3 National Film Unit productions that were nominated for Oscars.
I can remember him telling me about in 140 Days Under the World, there was a shot that he wanted of the icebreaker, the American icebreaker breaking through the ice. And so he got out on an ice floe, and he was standing there, and the ship was coming down straight on, and you're looking up, you know, through the camera lens. And apparently he was saying afterwards, the Americans like, "God damn, look at that silly Kiwi out there," you know, because it was very, very dangerous what he was doing. So that's what he was like. He wanted the best shot that he could get.
So there we were. Here was Kel, he was the explosive expert, and here was me, all ready to go. And Kel, I think it was, because he's, being a cameraman, would notice such things, said, "Where's Kit?" And we looked around. Oh, halfway between us and the building, which was about to be blown up by a single charge, was one sound recordist with 2 heavy Nagras around his neck and a pair of mics, standing very.
No, I was
standing out of
down.
the frame. No, you were standing. You were standing at that stage.
Just getting a good recording.
But you would have got a perfect recording.
For the location recording of the stereo sound, we had to use 2 Mark III Nagras, which were locked together by a common crystal generator. And so the process of recording meant you had to load a tape on each, lock it in, start each one rolling. Once everything was set, then I would use a little beep on each of the tapes simultaneously to provide a replay synchronization point.
When we got it back and the film started to be put together on the 3-screen editing bench, that's when it started to take shape.
Yeah, about the end of July, Dave, Jordan and I went into the 3-screen editing room to start assembling the film we had. At the same time, Rob Ritchie and Sam Grau were doing pickups for us around Wellington, and Kel was still flying around the country with Pete Van Ash, hunting down spectacular aerials. Well, Dave and I, working together, soon found that some of our ideas worked, but others didn't. This was a new way of working, and you had to look at how the images flowed together, and for a while that just wasn't working.
Ron Bowie was the producer when the 3-screen film was made, and I recall that at one stage he panicked because he'd seen part of the film and he could make neither head nor tail of it, and it seemed to him to be an enormous fiasco, and he wanted to close it down, and he more or less threw up his hands in horror and threw his apron over his head and sulked in a corner. But I have a strong suspicion that maybe Hugh and the other guys weren't terribly sanguine about it either. But anyway.
And the first lot of editing was a failure. It missed the boat.
When Ron went to Jeff and said that he thought it was going to be a disaster, Jeff did get extremely worried. Claude Wickstead, my boss in the sound department, went into Jeff and said, "Leave the boys alone, Jeff. They know what they're doing." He had faith in us, and he convinced Jeff that he should, in fact, leave us to it.
What we'd envisaged here was something different, very hard to comprehend and very hard to work technically and creatively. Now, Macdonald had a creative ability and the technical skill to get the damn thing together, and he was responsible for making, in the main, for making this is New Zealand.
When Dave and I got back into the cutting room and started discussing things, we noted that the sequences which didn't work had all one thing in common, that in fact the three screens contained information which was not related to each other. So that is a recipe for disaster. You had to have something unifying factor throughout the three screens. Each image had to relate to the one beside it, either by theme, subject, movement, or symmetry. Pretty soon we felt that we were getting it right.
Hugh and Dave would, they had the script, but then they specifically would want things, everyday life things, people doing everyday life things, which is a really good sequence in the film. So they would send Sam and I off to get specific things like kids going to school.
And Richie was good, a young fella, full of enthusiasm.
I had lots of fun working with Sam because he knew how to make things look really good because he'd been in advertising.
To flesh this out for their edit, I know I ended up by leaping into the trusty number 28 van that went everywhere around this country, and I ended up by taking off for weeks on end and actually ending up in places like Central Otago and South Westland at daybreak, sunset, and the most remarkable areas of the country.
Kel Fowler was still travelling up and down the country with Pete Van Ash of New Zealand Aerial Mapping Company.
We'd go to bed at night and you never knew what time the phone was, because we always were waiting on that call, whether the weather was going to be good. He would then leave and go and join Pete Van Ash, who would pick him up, and they would go then fly off and do the aerial shots around the mountains and down the South Island.
The most spectacular, without a doubt, aerials that we ever done at the film unit was for This Is New Zealand, where Kel Fowler did such a magnificent job.
Actually, some of the most spectacular footage came in right at the end of the shoot, and we put it in the last moments of editing.
The sound editing process always follows the picture editing, so we were making pre-selections from the best of the location quarter-inch recordings.
We used to transfer off a 1/4-inch tape, which is just a reel-to-reel tape recorder, onto 35 mag. Now here is some 35 magnetic tape, sprockets down the side, 4 sprockets to the frame, travelled at 90 feet a minute, 24 frames per second for film, and we would transfer it.
When it came to transferring the stereo location sound to the 35 magnetic, it was a complicated business because we had to transfer both tapes at precisely the same time. We had to line up 2 of these tapes at the tone, lock the capstan in, and then release the 2 tapes together. And if the tone was more than 3 or 4 wavelengths out, then I'd redo it until I got it right.
As we got into editing and the teething problems were out of the way, we realised that the best way to work was to actually work individually. and take 2 separate shifts. So what would happen is I'd come at 8:30 in the morning and I'd work through the day until about 3:30, and Dave would come in then and we'd review what I'd done and we'd catch up with everything we needed to do. Then I'd go off and spend the rest of the day doing other duties, and Dave worked through right through till late at night or until he was happy with the sequence he was working on. And in that way we managed to cover up to 20 hours a day.
For some reason, my memory of the editing of This Is New Zealand is these guys coming out, the 2 guys coming out of the editing room and with the rest of us in the tea room, and Dave was always happy. He was always self-confident. He always looked as if things were going absolutely fabulously, and he would sit there looking as if he was really, really pleased. He'd come out for these quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, looking as if he was really, really pleased with everything. I always remember that, because he always looked as if he really loved what he was doing. Very different for Dave, because he wasn't always like that, especially creative. He never was very confident in himself when he was creating, but he was very happy with that. I think it must have been he and Hugh got the thing done really well, so I think it was probably the collaboration with Hugh.
To me, one of the unsung heroes of that production was Dave Jordan. His dedication to what he was doing on that production, his artistic ability, his musical ability, basically his extreme artistic contribution was immense to that production.
Dave was not just a fine filmmaker, he was an accomplished musician, writer, wordsmith, you name it.
He had the twin loves of cinema and music, and always heard and saw the 2 things in his brain at the same time.
He'd pull out his guitar at the coffee bar or wherever we'd ended up at the end of the night, and start strumming away, and from there he started creating songs that were relevant to us.
I just wonder if he'll ever be appreciated properly for what he achieved as a songwriter.
His creative abilities covered many fields, and his contribution to This Is New Zealand was vast. For Dave and me, one of the most complex parts of the editing was when we designed a split-screen nature sequence. This was a mosaic of shots of flora and fauna, all linked by symmetry and setting. It took us at least a week to gather the elements we wanted and then to lay them out in a design form across certain areas of the 3 screens. Finally, we got it the way we wanted, and we took it with a whole lot of edge numbers and instructions to Graham Mears and Tony Buckler in the opticals department.
So this is the Oxbury printer, which would have been used by Tony and Graham in 1969 to produce the opticals for This Is New Zealand. We don't use it a hell of a lot these days. We still use them a little bit for students and people who want to continue with the traditional, but most of it's done now on the computer, a lot easier. What we could do in those days in a week, they could probably do in half an hour these days.
But although Graham and Tony could produce complex optical effects for This Is New Zealand in colour, in 1969 they had only black and white facilities at the NFU, and all of our colour footage had to go for processing to London.
So the whole thing was shipped off to England. You got a 6-week wait. Wow, there's some sweaty armpits waiting for that to come back, you know.
And I can remember going out at weekends to work on the soundtrack, because Hugh and Dave Jordan were often editing all week and half the nights as well, so I would go and use the machine on the weekends because we only had one machine. When all the soundtracks had been edited, we then set up the mixing panel, the mixing console on the soundstage, the old soundstage in Miramar. So a special projection box had to be built.
Bruce McKenzie to the soundstage, please. Bruce
I recall the mixing console that was brought in was a grey painted machine. I think it only had 9 channels. And Kit Rollings and Ron Skelly mixed the film.
So we would mix 6 of the soundtracks down onto one, do all the effects, and then we'd do the music in stereo. So we ended up with a music mix and an effects mix.
We had a 35 machine, not dissimilar to this machine, but it was a Toshiba machine, not horizontal here. The transport moved in a vertical mode. We ran stuff in off other machines linked over to the sound department, and it was quite a performance getting everything up and running. But once that mix was done, we watched it endlessly because it was so exciting.
The sound concept was amazing. The sound was a great part of the success of this show.
But it was the added punctuation of sound which is so important, and which Kit Rollings spent, so much time just labouring to get.
And they all put their hearts into it, and it showed in the film. You could see blood, sweat and tears and love coming out of this production. Magnificent, guys.
We now had a few short days, and the stage at Miramar was continuously busy running screenings for senior politicians, notable public figures, heads of Air New Zealand, and of course our mates.
And this thing cut loose. And we were close to 3 screens, and they were wide. They were like one widescreen today, but there was 3 of them. And we were stuck there being bashed with a soundtrack that we'd never run into before. It came from the front, it came from the left, it came from the right, it traversed across the screen.
It had all gone terribly smoothly, and we all loved the film and thought, yes.
And it was just an amazing headlong rush.
And suddenly all hell broke loose, panic. Because all the projectors had to be broken down, things had to be shifted, they had to be got to Osaka.
Expo was pretty important to New Zealand because it was coming at a time when Japan had shown signs of becoming one of our major trading partners.
This whole business of Britain joining the EEC has had a profound effect at grassroots level on New Zealanders' desire to find their own culture, because Mother England has suddenly disappeared and cut the apron strings, and now we have to discover our own way through the world. And that's why there was a big push to take stuff to Expo that year.
A typical Sunday morning at Expo 70. The time is 9:01, and the gates have just opened. Expo today will probably be visited by over 600,000 people.
I think only 1% of all the visitors to Expo were foreigners. The rest were Japanese, so 99% Japanese.
The New Zealand Pavilion was tops on their list. You couldn't miss it. And what they had to offer was so much appreciated and enjoyed by all of them.
I think perhaps because we were a small country, we just tried harder.
I think it's New Zealand Pavilion, very popular amongst Japanese. I heard it many times from my friends and visitors.
The site was massive. Everywhere the queues were, as soon as a queue formed, the security guards would rope you off, get it organised, keep the traffic flowing. No mayhem.
It was a really optimistic time
The late 60s and 1970, and even staging something like Expo 70 was an incredibly optimistic act.
It was a huge initiative of the government to outreach to this market, and we were immensely popular. We would be seconded to Lee Brewer and Dick Campion for their massive National Day production at Expo 70. So I was a carker bird and had a heavy load of running around for miles with my huge wings on with the other two guys.
At home, we didn't hear much about Expo 70 except a few small articles in the papers, but we knew at the film unit from reports from people over there that the pavilion was very successful and that the film was extremely popular.
We'd hear from people how impressed they had been with the film. Yeah. And, you know, in comparison with some of the other films we had seen at other pavilions, it was outstanding.
This was adjudged the best film there.
Everybody agreed with that. It was the best film out.
Every day there were 21 showings, and each one was 20 minutes duration. Most screenings were full to capacity. The seating was just arranged in tiers, so people walked along and they sat on a cushion on this tiered thing. We had red carpet covering these tiers, and we had a little piece left over. So when we had a VIP coming to the pavilion or to the cinema, we could unroll this stretch of red carpet from the road to the door, and they could walk along the red carpet until the Russians saw this one day, and they had this huge pavilion but no red carpet for VIPs, and they came to Little New Zealand to see if they could borrow our piece of red carpet.
The cinema audiences may not have noticed the coveted red carpet, but they were certainly bowled over by what they saw on the screens above it.
And even the on-site performers would queue to see the film as often as you could whenever you had a break. I seem to have this figure in my head that I may have seen it about 18 times.
J.R. Marshall, who was the minister at the time, said, "Jeff, I want the people of New Zealand to see this." Every time he saw the film, he burst into tears. He was an emotional man. It really got him, and he was carried away with "This is New Zealand." So he said, "We'll bring it back to New Zealand. The New Zealanders must see it."
Jeff had decided that Kel and I should shoot a film at Expo 70, and that this film would be used to screen before This is New Zealand in the screenings back home.
I had made an arrangement with Industries and Commerce that when Expo was over, I would inherit all the equipment, thank you, but not to be sold. I wanted it. Okay, you can have it. So we had all the gear in New Zealand. But I said, "Well, look, how are you going to..." He said, "You'll find a way. You do it." He said, "We've got no money to do it with. You do it." Hell. So I went up to Kerridge and said to Kerridge, "Well, I've got this film. Can you give me a theatre in Wellington to try it out, and we'll install this gear in the theatre?" He said, "Oh, yeah." There's one proviso. He says that you run it. You will run the show. And I said, "Oh, hell, I've got a studio to run. I can't exhibit films." My old days. They said, "If you don't do it, deal's off. We'll play it 50-50. I'll supply the staff. I'll supply the theatre. You supply the projectionists and the equipment and the film, and we'll go 50-50 in the proceeds." Okay. Right. So I said, "Done." So it cost me nothing. I said, "Who's going to pay for the alterations in the theatre for a start?" He said, "We will. We'll take it out of the receipts." I said, "Oh, good."
Because of the weight of equipment and all the conversions required to the cinemas, the film was presented only in the four main centres. It started at Wellington, then went to Christchurch, then Dunedin, finally Auckland.
The standard theatres in New Zealand, which had two projectors, just simply couldn't run This is New Zealand because there were three films that had to be run simultaneously on the screen. So the projection plant, or the 3 projectors that were used to run This Is New Zealand in Japan, were brought back to New Zealand, and in each instance a new projection room had to be built, either in front of the existing projection room in the circle or another projection room in the rear of the stalls. This projection room was quite large because it had to accommodate a lot of equipment. This Is New Zealand, together with the short that we ran before it, made up a program of about 40 minutes. And we ran it every hour on the hour.
The reaction of the audience, I mean, they just kept coming and coming. They wouldn't go away. It was, you know, phenomenal.
Session after session completely booked, and people waiting outside to get in.
The outgoing audience would be directed out through the side exits, and the new audience would be fed into the auditorium, and the foyer of the auditorium was usually very, very full of people wanting to see This Is New Zealand.
They started from the cash desk and went up Wellesley Street and round down into Lawn Street. That's how big the queues were.
My first experience with This Is New Zealand was seeing the movie as a schoolboy. I was at Pukerua Bay Primary School, 1971, so I would have been 10 years old.
Everybody thought it was really, really special, and was so proud that this had been used to show us to the rest of the world at the Osaka Expo.
It was like the moral and cultural duty of every citizen of New Zealand to see the movie. So there I was with my school class, and I went and looked at it at the embassy and really enjoyed it. And I remember going back and seeing it a second time with my mum and dad.
Yeah, I think the answer probably tells you more about me than it does about the film, me as a 17-year-old, because my response was really quite ambivalent. I was completely blown away by the visceral experience of the film, but I was really resistant to the picture of New Zealand that it portrayed.
Some of the audience were actually in tears when they left the auditorium because it had had such a dramatic emotional effect on them.
There's no question that the way it looked on cinema was an enormous experience for people at the time. We hadn't seen anything like that.
I suspect, like a lot of people, what I came away with was the Karelia suite and belting over the Southern Alps. I became mildly obsessed with that music, actually, and I'm sure I'm not the only one.
As a school kid, I came out of the embassy thinking that Sibelius was the new national anthem of New Zealand.
Certainly this film had that kind of effect originally, and I think it still does. The Sibelius sort of became the national anthem, didn't it?
During the production of the 3-screen film, I remember going to the sound department one day, and Hugh and others in the crew were listening to a piece of music which I recognised as a pop version, a rock version perhaps, of movement from the Sibelius Karelia suite. And Hugh said, "Oh, we're thinking of using this in the film." And I said, "Whereabouts?" And he said, "Oh, over some aerials, you know, grandeur, mountains, all that sort of thing." And he said, "But it doesn't seem quite right somehow." And I said, "Well, why don't you use the original?" And he said, "Well, can we get hold of it?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I've got half a dozen versions at least."
So the following Saturday morning, Hugh, David and I went up to Arthur Everard's place, and from his hugely impressive collection of LPs, we chose unanimously the best version.
It was sort of ceremonial, slightly bouncy, with a good bounce to it, but also a good martial feeling. And that was the version by Sir John Barbaroli and the Halle. And I can still remember it was on HMV ASD 2272. I remember that because people kept ringing up afterwards just saying, "Oh, what's the music?"
I mean, you couldn't find a more perfect music score to accompany the film. Interesting how something written for Finland, that spirit has worked so well for New Zealand.
Yes, as far as the music was concerned, there was some public comment about why we didn't use a New Zealand composer. Well, in those days, there were some New Zealand composers like Douglas Lilburn and David Farquhar, but they didn't have the range of music which we wanted. However, we did use many New Zealand pieces in it, which perhaps a lot of people didn't realise. And there was the Avengers, there were other pop groups, and in particular the Acme Sausage Company, where we had, I think, 4 or 5 pieces.
And so we got involved with this film of Hugh's playing the trumpet and writing music for it and arguing about what should happen in pubs and things like that. It was a band that I had put together called the Acme Sausage Company. And it included Bruno and Gary Gervin and John Charles. But John Charles was key in shaping that music, I remember. I think it was probably amongst the first stuff that we ever did for film. And John started to emerge as the composer. Up till then, he was the piano player in the band. It turned out that he was a brilliant film composer and wrote for the full orchestra and was quite comfortable doing so and quite extraordinarily accomplished at it.
The music for the Molesworth cattle sequence was the Avengers, The Days of Pearly Spencer, and it was used minus the vocal track.
At the time, the Hamilton County Bluegrass Band were huge. They were old friends, and of course we had to have some of them on the soundtrack, so we used one of their tracks on the fairground sequence. In all, there are a total of 10 New Zealand music tracks that were included on the final soundtrack of This Is New Zealand.
The ticket prices for this film was 40 cents for adults and 20 cents for children.
It was a terrific money-making success at 40 cents and 20 cents.
It was phenomenal, the amount of people that went through our turnstiles.
I'd been used to showing a number of National Film Unit shorts. I'd shown dozens of them. And these shorts were regarded very highly. They were sometimes promoted by the theatre manager. Because New Zealanders generally like to see them.
It was quite common to have a film unit short movie before the feature film. And I know that as kids we used to sometimes groan when we realised it was about to come on. It's like, oh no, and we were going to have 20 minutes of sheep shearing or something was going to happen. But you know, that's certainly not true of This Is New Zealand. I mean, that was a genuinely creative piece of filmmaking.
After the last screening at the embassy in Auckland and they closed the doors and took down the signs, this looked as if this could be the last time This Is New Zealand would be seen in public.
We were going to do a CinemaScope print, and I decided not to.
But we had made some test strips in the hope that printing the 3 films onto one reel of CinemaScope film would enable us to screen This Is New Zealand in any standard widescreen New Zealand cinema.
The problem in those days was, you know, optical printing, which was fantastic. It was the thing of the day, right? But when you wanted to put these 3 pieces of film onto one film, it could be done. But unfortunately, it couldn't be done with any kind of quality, right?
The tests were a technical failure and the plan was abandoned.
I mean, the interesting thing with This Is New Zealand is that it did give a lot of credibility to the National Film Unit.
I joined the Miramar Studios in '62 and found it a most amazing place to work. There was all sorts of interesting people doing all sorts of interesting things. By the late 60s, it was obvious that the film unit had outgrown the premises and the studios were physically falling down. And the hunt started for a new premises, or a site to build new premises. And Geoffrey Scott, who was our manager, looked across the park at the old Shell tank farm and thought that'd be a great place to build a studio. And he was correct. Peter Jackson, many years later, has built Park Road Post, and there's still one of the old tanks at a garden centre next door. And we ended up eventually being out at Lower Hutt with fancy new studios.
But the move to the new location was not to last. The studios were put up for sale and eventually ended up in Peter Jackson's hands.
And we've subsequently changed the name to Park Road Post, but it's, you know, still the same company. The spirit is there still, and we've shifted back to Miramar. And we're literally, like the building we're in now is only a couple of 100 yards away from where the film unit first begun. So there is a cycle has been completed somehow.
And Park Road was to be the place where eventually This Is New Zealand would be restored in full high quality. But it was going to be a few years before the right technology and the people who could use it were to arrive.
I saw This Is New Zealand when I was 12 years old and remember travelling down from Masterton very excitedly to see it at the Embassy Theatre in Wellington. And I remember just being awestruck at the time to see the three projectors take a very wide image. I was one of the team that worked on a production for Te Papa called Golden Days, which is still running to this very day. I'd actually worked for the film unit for a short period of time myself, and had been lucky enough to work on one of Hugh's films that he had produced. So when the opportunity to work on Golden Days came up, and I saw in the storyboard that there was a homage to This Is New Zealand, I told the director of Golden Days I could probably ask Hugh for a copy of the film.
I'd been given a used 35mm print and soundtrack by Roy Lance. Roy was a member of the technical staff of the film unit. He was a motion picture engineer, and he was the genius that kept all the equipment functioning properly and the whole three-screen circus on the road. Somehow word about this print got round, and I began to be pressured by various individuals who wanted to borrow the print and transfer it to VHS. VHS had always been an inferior recording medium technically, and the image was not good, and so it would have looked utterly ridiculous in a small, square, old-fashioned television set. But when Alan came along with the Golden Days idea, I knew it had the backing of Archives New Zealand, and Alan was a trusted friend, and I knew that in his hands the print would be safe.
I made a booking to transfer the film, and I was meant to only transfer a small portion due to copyright reasons, but left alone with the machinery I inadvertently dubbed all three reels onto tape. And I had sat on those reels for a good 5 years without any, well, I'd never had the technology to do anything with them. But then I started making DVDs and realised using the widescreen format I could actually put all three reels together and make a widescreen DVD.
It was only really when Alan Honey's DVD came along that it was possible to see This Is New Zealand for the first time in decades.
Although it did take 40 years for the restoration of This Is New Zealand to happen, I think there were a lot of people in New Zealand who have been trying to bring the film back, and there's been certain key things that have stopped that.
At Archives we didn't have 3 projectors, let alone all the other paraphernalia that was necessary.
I mean, it's odd that this film, you know, went unseen for so long, for more than 3 decades, but in a way this is actually the right time for it to emerge, because you now have the technology to clean it up. People now have the displays that make it worth watching. You know, people have widescreen TVs. Can you imagine on your little old TV? It wouldn't have worked.
The preparatory work on This Is New Zealand was bringing all of the original master negatives and the soundtrack out of the vaults. Then each of those was individually assessed. We had to go through very painstakingly and check every single edit Old edits from archival films have a tendency of drying out and they can actually split apart. So we need to make sure that didn't happen on any of the machines.
With the advent of digital intermediates, we were able to scan the negatives of This Is New Zealand, and what were originally 3 pieces of negative, we were able to scan those at a very, very high resolution and then manipulate them in the computer and then output them back onto one piece of 35mm film.
When it came to remastering the soundtrack, although in '69 the 3-track magnetic system was quite advanced for the period, given today's technology, we were able to take the masters, put them into a computer, and then add the extra channels for 5.1, which we then mixed out at Park Road Post. This was an exciting event since we were now working in one of the world's leading technical and creative film sound mixing facilities.
Yeah, it's good, Billy.
Working with sound mixers Gilbert Lake and John Neal in every sound designer's dream environment, we brought the soundtrack of This Is New Zealand right back to the top of contemporary cinematic standards. That has to be nice.
And right over us, and we use the surround. Nice to use the surrounds for something specific.
Yeah, it is.
And we sure didn't have that 40 years ago.
The range of sound mixing possibilities that's the norm today was just sheer science fiction to us back in 1969. The sound mix was the last stage in the restoration, and once it was done we looked forward to the first public screenings, which were in Bill Gosden's 2007 New Zealand Film Festivals.
We did do one pre-screening of the film where an excerpt was projected for the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra.
The premiere of the full restored movie will be held at the end of this month at the Park Road post-production facility in Miramar. Tonight we get a sneak preview of part of it as the orchestra plays live the music we heard on the soundtrack from the Karelia suite of Sibelius.
It brought back all those memories of having seen it in the early 70s when everybody in the country went to see that movie. There was this enormous sense of grandeur about the film when we saw it in the 70s, and all that came back.
And that was very, very successful, and that boosted the film's profile actually really, really well to then coincide with the film screenings. The film screened around the major centres in New Zealand and then toured the smaller centres.
I think I bought us the tickets, and I didn't really know, and I didn't research it before, and I just said, oh, this looks cool, this could be amazing, and you know, it was made for Expo 70, and let's go along and see what it's like. I remember looking over at Greg throughout it and thinking, my God, this is just so cool, and both of us feeling just gobsmacked at how totally us it was.
The way New Zealand is portrayed in the film in 1970 is a very honest one. It doesn't have the hype that you might expect from a promotional film about New Zealand. And so in that sense, it does resonate with my memories of New Zealand because of that honesty.
It was a representation of New Zealand without the shiny kind of, you know, exterior of it's pristine and beautiful and everyone's happy and smiling, and in fact the antithesis of that, and you have the crying child, and which was so charming. And you know, I can't help but think, working in advertising, what the client would say, oh, but the child's crying, that must mean that New Zealand's a terrible place, you know.
That was why that bloody film, to me, was so successful, and why people walked out of that theatre rubbing their eyes, because it was so candidly honest.
It moves me to tears every time I see it, and yet I find it hilarious. That it has this kind of playful, I mean, it reminds me of Len Lai even. It has that sort of delightful, playful movement about it.
The picture was as sparkling as ever. It looked good, but it was a time capsule. It had this feeling of when we were young and fit and could do anything.
There's things there that some of the Māori culture that we weren't that up to date with in those days.
What a beautiful homage at the start to Puna from the iwi, the various iwi throughout Aotearoa. Hugh and his colleagues at the time got it absolutely right, you know, paying tribute to the mana whenua of Aotearoa.
The film is such a beautiful presentation of our innocence.
The society that's described in the film is one that we feel kind of nostalgic about now, not necessarily for good reasons, I think, but of course the natural splendour of the country is something that we all still identify with very clearly.
Well, of course, when you look at the film, the countryside itself hasn't really changed. I love driving around New Zealand, and it's there, of course, that the land endures.
I mean, it's a pretty amazing experience seeing it again.
Well, I mean, technically, it just continues to astonish.
One image was the train that goes past the camera, and then on the next screen it goes the other way, and then the other way. It sort of zigzags its way and across these three screens. And I remembered that image from being a kid. I've had that in my mind for decades, and then I saw it again, and there it was.
There's a great deal of individuality, you know, and there's wit, and there are visual puns. They did things they thought might be fun.
Well, one of the shots that got the big reaction as a school kid was the scene of somebody in a dentist chair. I remember that.
The cities have changed, and when you look at some of the scenes in the offices and people out and about in the streets, there's a certain, they look a little bit odd, they look a little bit quaint in their walk shorts and long socks.
Fortunately, a few things have gone, like guys in their walk shorts and walk socks, they're not around anymore. Sometimes it's good to move on, but great to have the record.
And I actually wonder whether you could make that now. I wonder whether, if you were making something like that, it would be so much more managed and so much more on message that it wouldn't be quite the same. Because I think there are parts of that film that are just wildly off message. You know, the building's being demolished. Why would you have something as negative as a building being demolished in your movie? But it works as a 360-degree portrait.
You had this amazing freedom to just go out and take what was a brief to make a film for World Expo and turn it into something so much more. I mean, now that would be, I think, damn near impossible.
Seeing something like this in New Zealand reminds you that we're not likely to see anything like it again.
It's a perfect crystallisation of a particular view of the country, and I think its value as such is enormous and will endure.
But what This Is New Zealand did is that it captured something of the spirit of the country, and you know, that's what's missing from anything that happens today, is that you get the facts, you get the news reports, or you get the entertainment through a soap opera, but you don't get anything that reflects the spirit of the nation and the sort of just the vibe of the country.
It's more than a 3-screen trick film that showed at an expo.
It gets to the essence of what things were like in those days.
The craftsmanship of the whole edit and the way it's put together, that's something I haven't seen before. So, yeah, just as a film, an individual film on its own, it's really dynamic.
The marriage of the people in the land, and the people in the sea. I reckon in 40 years' time it would be just as powerful.
This Is New Zealand was a magnificent production, in my opinion. It couldn't be bettered by anybody.